Hi there, Kyle, the angry archaeologist. We're looking at the Colossi of Amenhotep III, also known as the Colossi of Memnon, its secrets as they relate to an ancient Egyptian diplomatic mission in the 18th dynasty of Egypt, across the Aegean powers of the day, referred to as the Aegean List by archaeologist Dr. Eric H. Cline. In other words, how these statues relate to Egypt, its neighbors, trade, diplomacy, but also imperialism of the Egyptian New Kingdom, and how they provide more context for Bronze Age shipwrecks from the period like the famous Uluburun Shipwreck off the coast of Turkey. I am largely presenting to you the findings of Dr. Eric H. Cline, an archaeologist who specializes in the late Bronze Age, and his paper Sailing the Great Green Sea, Amenhotep III's Aegean List from Calm El Hatan once more. This is a paper freely available via academia.edu. The term Great Green Sea is used by the Egyptians to refer to the Mediterranean Sea. And the main themes of the video are Egyptian imperialism and diplomacy during the New Kingdom, and I think they also help to contextualize, which we'll see a little bit later, a Bronze Age shipwreck which ferried goods between the Bronze Age power centers of the day, the famous Uluburun Shipwreck, which we will also look at. The Colossi of Memnon stand an impressive 18 meters or 60 feet in height and weigh around 720 tons each. Now, the name Colossi of Memnon refers to the fact that the Greeks identified the whole Theban Necropolis, near modern-day Luxor in Egypt, where the statues are located, with the Ethiopian Egyptian king from the Iliad of Homer, Memnon, whose name means steadfast. A hero who fought to defend the ancient city of Troy, identified as Hisarlik and Çanakkale province, modern-day Turkey, forgive the pronunciations. Despite being highly mythologized, Troy was a real city with a long habitation, a very long habitation. The claim specifically that the Homeric Memnon referred to the historical pharaoh Amenhotep III was something that was enforced by a very late Egyptian Greek historian, the famous Menthio of the 3rd century BCE, 1,000 years after Amenhotep III lived. And we're not analyzing Homer in this video, but just know the Colossi of Amenhotep III represent Amenhotep III, pharaoh of Egypt, of the 18th dynasty in the 14th century BCE. But it is safe to say the Colossi have fascinated and beguiled people in many ways for a long time. And just a quick side note, this is not a statue of Menthio exactly. Rather, it is a statue representing a high priest of the cult of Serapis. Serapis being an Egyptian Greek syncretic deity promoted by the Ptolemaic dynasty since around the 4th, 3rd centuries BCE. The Roman historian Plutarch likened Menthio with the priesthood of Serapis, and there are reports of statues and temples of Serapis bearing the name Menthio associated via Coptic with the Egyptian god Teoth or Dejhuti. Know that Menthio came from Sebatinos, a lower Egyptian city. Note that Menthio Sebenitos is most famous for creating his 30 dynastic king list of ancient Egypt, a source of chronology for Egyptian studies since antiquity. However, we only have indirect sources of Menthio, sadly, so summaries and references of his work and other works from antiquity, but he is a very important figure in Egyptology. Thankfully, we have the benefit of modern advancements in archaeology, history, and Egyptology to be able to say that these colossi are indeed of Pharaoh Amenhotep III, one of the greatest kings of not just the 18th dynasty, but of all Egyptian history, arguably. However, the colossi are but a poor remnant of what was once represented here on this site. We have here a recreation of what the site once was. The colossi were in fact once the front-facing dual statues of Amenhotep III's grand mortuary complex, the gates flanked by Pharaoh's colossi, leading towards an inner sanctum where the god-king transformed resided in perpetuity. The inner sanctum, of course, being the only available to the highest elites of Egyptian society. The front-facing outer colossi of Amenhotep III were as far as commoners were allowed to enter, so these statues would have been where the peasantry of Egypt came to pay their respects to their beloved pharaoh. So this recreation was found on a German site, LISA Wissenschaften portal, and it's a funny thing in general, maybe outside of academia, don't know this, but German is actually a required language in Egyptology. Because the Germans studied and have written copious amounts on Egypt for centuries by now. But this website, aside from its value in presenting this recreation, however, the site conservation work at the Colossi of Amenhotep III highlights an important fact, that is, historical monuments like the Colossi of Amenhotep III or any other monument requires modern conservation and modern stewardship in order to remain a part of world cultural heritage. And before continuing, I just want to highlight how monuments like these are really dynamic, living entities. It's a helpful perspective to have for sure in archaeology. The Colossi are located in Thebes, and again we turn to Greek for Egyptian nomenclature, but Thebes, modern Luxor, Egypt, was called Waset, or City of the Scepter, City of Power, capital of the New Kingdom of Egypt since Ahmose, after the war between Thebes and the Hyksos. Hyksos, possibly a Canaanite peoples from the Levant region, who invaded Egypt in the Second Intermediate Period, who controlled the city of Avaris in the north. Hyksos' rule ended when Theban or Waset supremacy over all of Egypt was established in the 18th dynasty. Although there is considerable debate what roles played by early Theban pharaohs, especially Ahmose of the 18th, but also Kamose, last ruler of the 17th dynasty at Thebes, during the war with the Hyksos, in re-establishing Egyptian supremacy in the late 17th, early 18th dynasty. Indeed, the Egyptian Empire expanded quite a bit to the north and south of Thebes in the New Kingdom, the Colossi being in a way a product of this imperialism. Before we begin to unravel the mystery of the Aegean List hieroglyphic inscription on the great Colossi of Amenhotep III, let me first say that the Theban Necropolis is probably one of the most famous necropolis of the ancient world, because it is here, nearby the remains of the mortuary temple of Amenhotep III, is the Valley of the Kings, the resting place for the kings and queens of the New Kingdom of Egypt, since possibly the time of Amenhotep I or before. And if you would like to explore the Valley of the Kings, there is an excellent online resource available to you called the Theban Mapping Project. This is a free website, an interactive map of the valley's royal tombs, which goes far beyond mere identification, but allows users access to what really amounts to a guided tour of the tombs. For example, here, Amenhotep II's tomb, now not the father of Amenhotep III of the Colossi, but within the same dynasty. Individual chambers, like the burial chamber here, and passages, and the individual histories of each component and detailed descriptions of each tomb component, and also beautiful pictures taken from the inner sanctums of these hallowed places. I highly recommend you all take a look. I have provided a link below to this amazing and free resource. The Colossi have here at their bases a very interesting and quite unique inscription that Professor Eric H. Cline calls the famous Aegean List. We can see within cartouches beneath bound captives, bearing names of places. The hieroglyphs within contain a determinative resembling three hills and a landscape horizon orientation, which conveys the idea of a foreign territory. This enables us to identify them as place names, not a person's name. These places are phonetically spelled in Middle Egyptian, so these are foreign names of places spelled out using the Egyptian writing system, and the figures then are representing the peoples of these places. The places mentioned are mostly from Minoan Crete and Mycenaean Greece during the reign of Amenhotep III. And if we compare with some of the archaeology at these places, some of the Egyptian artifacts found in the Greek and Minoan territories, Professor Eric H. Cline created a map here of the find spots of Egyptian artifacts in Greece and Minoan Crete, which unequivocally date to at least the beginning of the reign of Pharaoh Amenhotep III. That is because this map represents finds of inscribed ancient Egyptian scarabs bearing the pharaoh's name, Amenhotep III, and his wife Ti. Now here is an edited map of the concentrations of these scarabs which bear the name Amenhotep III. The green concentration is at the very famous site of Mycenae on the Peloponnese Peninsula and its port city of Naupilo. In total, 15 scarabs bearing the name of Amenhotep III were found here. And here are some images of the site of Mycenae. We see the famous Lion's Gate of Mycenae. These were built around 1250 BCE, about a century after Amenhotep III, but the site was very important before then as well. And southern Komnos in southern Crete, a Minoan site. These are the sites with the highest scarab artifacts bearing the name Amenhotep III, and we're going to see why that is significant. Many of these, in fact all of these, are thought to be diplomatic gifts, says archaeologist Eric H. Cline, gifts that arrived at the same time within a single voyage. thought to be commemorated by the Colossi of Amenhotep III, and the purpose of this trip was primarily to establish trade relations and military alliances with the growing power of the Mycenaeans, and the re-established, strengthened trade relations and military alliances with the somewhat fading power of the Minoans on Crete. Now, despite the mission and the Scarab remnants being emblematic of a diplomatic mission, as Derek H. Cline argues, if we turn to the hieroglyphic inscription, true to Egyptian propaganda forms, the text is the furthest thing from diplomatic in its treatment of the same foreign realms, the Mycenaeans at Mycenae and the Minoans on Crete. Indeed, we're going to begin with the introductory inscription above the place names on the monuments, the Colossi of Amenhotep III. Now here, I need to caution you regarding the introductory hieroglyphic inscription, because I'm largely going off of what Eric H. Cline and Stephen M. Stanish, Stanish being the expert on hieroglyphs, Egyptologist consulted by Professor Cline, have provided specifically for the introductory statement, their transliteration of the introduction at the Colossi, because the transliteration is the vocals written in the Roman alphabet that we recognize, that we use in our dictionary for hieroglyphs. And I had to use the transliteration that they provided because I am unable to read the individual hieroglyphs on the introduction from the pictures in the article, and I'm also unable to find any in good detail. So this is what I'm going off of, transliteration, but I've researched and looked up the words, and I stand by my rendering of the hieroglyphs visually here for you based on the transliteration provided by Professor Stanish. But I still wanted to do my due diligence for you all to the best of my ability, and this image of the third panel in the article, Sailing the Great Green Sea by Eric Cline and Professor Stanish, and I can see this image in particular. I do see highly damaged inscriptions which do correspond roughly to the transliteration provided in the article, and this is my reason, so you know that I assert the introductory statement stood above the place names in the Aegean List on the Colossi. I suspect that they were reconstructed by looking at both Colossi and seeing what was eligible on each, but that's just my theory. We begin above the captives, just beneath the giant feet of Amenhotep III. The inscription reads, "All the difficult lands of the far north that stretch out beyond, and all the lands of the Fenu," a term for the Syrian Phoenician peoples, "these adversaries well subdued," referencing the image on the Colossi, "before the 2 feet of this great god," quite literally, the feet of Amenhotep III. Now, I found Pehu, the far north. I did not see Pewit, a derogatory term for Nubia in the south, so I break with Stanish here, since his transliteration does not have Pewit, it has Pehu. But just so you know, the Nubians were under Egyptian suzerainty here, largely, the viceroyship of Nubia being established early on in the 18th dynasty. However, they were the most formidable of the Nubians, and they were not a monolithic group, but the most formidable were the Kerma, famed archers, their territory called Ta Seti, land of the bow by the Egyptians, and together with the Hyksos, although they didn't, not sure if they actually worked together, but together, nevertheless, they did conquer Egyptian territory, and they ruled Egyptian territory from the end of the 13th dynasty in the Middle Kingdom to the beginning of the 18th dynasty in Egypt. This is called the Second Intermediate Period. So right off the bat, you have the Colossi re-establishing in rhetoric the power of Egypt over its former foes, and Southerners are referenced later on, but it appears the Colossi have an initial focus on the northern enemies of Egypt. The introduction continues, "The great ones of all the sand dwellers." This is a derogatory term for Libyan peoples in North Africa. The Southerners and Northerners, they did not dare approach Egypt since the time of this exalted god, Amenhotep III. Indeed, they came on their knees in likeness of a place united in order to give them the breath of life, their tribute on their backs. This phrase, "give them the breath of life," seems to function something like our "put them to the sword" or "impress foreigners with Egyptian majesty." In the phrase "tribute on their back," we see a very violent and angry rhetoric clearly putting non-Egyptians in a very subservient role before Amenhotep III, something that is at odds with the diplomacy of the mission's intent in the Aegean List. Uh, Nevertheless, this kind of mortuary propaganda helped to cement the pharaoh as a protector of Egypt, and the Colossi are responding also to the collective trauma of Egypt that suffered under foreign rulers not just a few centuries prior. So we see Egypt acting very militaristically in the 18th dynasty and the New Kingdom in general. One resource available to us regarding the militarism of Egypt in the New Kingdom are two autobiographies of two soldiers from two different tombs. One located in El Kab, it's Ahmose son of Ibana, a naval officer, and the second located in the Nechen Necropolis nearby, Ahmose Pen-Nekbet, are two military officials who served together from the reigns of Ahmose all the way to Tutmosis II. Now, these tomb engravings detail what one scholar has called the oldest military careers, both slightly before the reign of Amenhotep III, but they paint a picture of not only a highly expansive Egyptian state at this time, but a centralized royal authority in Egypt, and also a pervading sense of spiritualism connected specifically to the military service for the pharaoh at this time. I've attached an essay I wrote on Ahmose Pen-Nekbet. If you're interested in learning more, please see the attached PDF below. Now, returning to the Colossi, the Aegean List, we're going to be tracing the voyage as described in the monument on the map here. Facing the Colossi, we begin on the right side of the Colossi. The first two bound foreigners on the Colossi. The direction of the faces of humans and animals tells you which way to read hieroglyphs. Always read into the faces and down. They read first Kiftu, or Crete, and Dan Aya, a Homeric term for Mycenaean Greek people. So we have at the start two general, more ethnic descriptors than geographic locations, just as a preference for the scope of the voyage, I think, centering on these two realms, which were on Minoan Crete at least at this time. There was considerable cultural and political overlap between the Minoan Cretians and the Mycenaeans. Next we have the beginning of the voyage proper. First stop was Imnisa, or Amnisos, on Crete, then Biasati, or Fiastos, and Kitui, Kituni, another term for Crete, all these located on Crete. So on the map of Crete here we have two locations, Aminosis in the north, near Knossos, and the south we have Fiastos. And then we have possibly another general term for Crete, but which also could have been a location somewhere in the island now lost to time. Here is a look at the voyage as it begins from northern Crete. Interestingly, northern Crete, because one would think the Egyptians would approach from the south, but boats at this time preferred to hug the shorelines, so the Egyptians probably traveled here a long way up the Levant and through the coast of along the coast of Syria and Turkey, because overseas travels were very dangerous. The inscription continues, the Aegean List on the other side of the Colossi here. This side, much better preserved, it begins Diakis, which could be Boeotian Thebes, but this is uncertain. Then we have Midiani, Mycenae, the city of Mycenae. Then we have Nupiru, or Naupilion, the port city of Mycenae. And then Katir, the island of Kythria on Greece. Now, we're seeing the voyage leave Minoan Crete and entering territory more overtly Mycenaean, and the following numbers here can reiterate the voyage. So the inscription has the voyage beginning on the north coast of Crete, and then the southern coast, and then continuing 4, possibly 5 locations in the Mycenaean world, and ending at 6, the island of Kythria. At this point, the map gets a bit difficult to represent, and there is a controversy. We have at the first location here at the end of panel 2, Wieri, which could be Ilios, Troy, or Ireai on the Peloponnese, Greece, and then Kan Iswa, famous Knossos on Crete, and then finally Imiasa again on Crete. The first location, Wiari, Ilios, city of Troy. Did they go to Troy? Professor Eric H. Cline said they did in an earlier paper, but the Aegean List paper with Stanish he wrote a bit later, he wrote this idea should be dismissed, and he did so without explaining his thinking much, but I think if we take a look at the Amenhotep III scarab distribution map, we don't see any scarabs there or anywhere near there, so the lack of Egyptian material there probably reflects his change of mind. Now, going off of also the map of Amenhotep III's scarab, we have the next location, rather than being Troy, Elis. So there's another island called Ilia within the center of the Aegean, but the paper says that this is a location on the northwest coast of the Peloponnese. So numbers 7 there. And then the voyage made its way back to Crete. So numbers 8 and 9. And again, I know the map is looking cluttered, but please follow the number plan and pause the video and trace the voyage. But the next location is Ridiuka or Lyktos on Crete. And then back to Greece, the Peloponnese Peninsula again, nearby Boeotian Thebes, and then on the peninsula, Mycenae and Naupilan. So it's the purple line going through numbers 10 and 11, which I made a bit larger here so you can see them. And the last location in the Aegean list is Saitai or Saitia, Crete. And the last location in the Aegean list, although I don't see this in the hieroglyphs myself, Eric Cline and Stanish have put it in number 12 yellow line here, coming back from Mycenaean Greece towards the far east coast of Crete, is the last part of the journey, which geographically makes sense as the Egyptians were at this time on their way home, which again hugged the shoreline rather than cross the Mediterranean. And as I know the map is with the lines difficult to see, here's a simplified version of the itinerary of the Aegean List. So we can see they started off one on Crete, and then they're making their way up to Boeotius, Thebes, Greece, and then going to Mycenae and Naupilan, and then making their way to the island Kythria, and then to the western side of the Peloponnese Peninsula, and then back to Crete. That's essentially the voyage, and it's more simplified, easier to see a diagram. This brings up the question, why did they travel here in the first place? Well, Professor Eric H. Cline says the Egyptians under Amenhotep III were seeking out Mycenaean Greek allies against the rising power of the Hittites. That's the pink-colored faction in Anatolia there. The Hittites being an Anatolian people who many scholars think migrated from the Caucasus region originally. Now, by the later Bronze Age, however, threatening power against Egyptian security, especially the Egyptian imperial possessions in the Levant region of Syrio-Palestine, that's the yellow color of Egypt, buttressing up against the Mitanni people in green here. Now, the Mitanni people being a former rival of Egypt, but who would eventually come into a defensive pact against the Hittites, Syrio-Palestine region, present-day Palestine, Israel, this area the Egyptians considered essential for their national security, and whose activity here goes back, their imperial activity at least, going back to at least Pharaoh Ahmose, the first pharaoh of the 18th dynasty, when he captured the ancient city of Gaza. The Hittites under Thudalia III, and then under King Supiliuma I, were the largest threats to Egyptian security since the Second Intermediate Period, since the time of the Kerma and the Hyksos. So the Egyptians under Amenhotep III were trying to block the expansion of the Hittites. We know that by the time of Ramses the Great there were large-scale battles between the Egyptians and the Hittites. For instance, this plaque commemorates either the Battle of Kadesh, the siege of Dapur associated with that battle. The deeply embellished story by Ramses represented here nonetheless shows that the two powers were indeed lasting rivals in the Syrio-Palestine region, and this relief from the Ramseum mortuary temple at Thebes or Waset definitely reflects that long-lasting rivalry. And the Hittites before and also not too far after seem to have had a lot of issues consolidating power. There was a lot of assassinations and infighting amongst the elites. But during the reign of Amenhotep III, Thudalia III, and then Supiliuma I, they effectively changed the geopolitical landscape when they successfully united this Anatolian people. But just note, please, that this map here, several of the factions represented are not monolithic political units, unlike Egypt at this time or the Hittites at this time. For instance, to the left of the Hatti, left of the Hittites, the land of the Arzawa, In reality, they appear to have been more of a loose coalition of several political entities, sometimes working in concert together, sometimes rivals, probably kingdoms. But the mission of, and this is, it was the political unity of the Hittites that the mission of Amenhotep III was responding to diplomatically by seeking out an alliance with the Mycenae. But the mission of Amenhotep III also had an economic component in scope, as diplomacy often does. For instance, we know from across Egypt at least 30 sites with Mycenaean pottery, a Mycenaean pottery class referred to as LH3A2. These vessels found all the way at the very north, Lower Egypt, and all the way into the far south of Upper Egypt. Here is an image of this class of Mycenaean pottery. Now, they would have been importing Greek oils and wine, and indeed by the 19th dynasty, imports of Greek oils and wine may have even increased under the Ramseyite dynasty, suggesting how successful Amenhotep III's mission to establish a higher degree of relations with the Mycenae was. And this brings us to something I've been looking forward to speaking about in particular. Later in the Bronze Age, we have the famous Uluburun Shipwreck near Kash, present-day Turkey, found in 1982 by a 17-year-old sponge diver. It sank sometime around 1300 BCE. Professor Eric H. Cline called this shipwreck, quote, the physical embodiment of international relations of the period, because it shows the cosmopolitan economic relations during the later Bronze Age. It ferried copper oxide ingots, and also tin probably, but tin degrades over time, so none was present. They were making bronze. It was the Bronze Age after all. 10 tons of copper on the ship. Amazing that they were trading via sea this amount. The term talent was used as a measuring quantity. It seems to have been an Eastern term that got borrowed into Greek. For archaeologists, it took 6,600 hours excavation time over a 10-year period. That's 22,000 individual dives to fully excavate the shipwreck, a truly Sisyphean task for archaeology, aquatic archaeology. A few major diagnostics on board also allowed for more precise dating. For instance, there's a golden scarab of Queen Nefertiti, bearing the name Nefertiti, which means the beautiful one has come, the wife of Akhenaten or Amenhotep IV, the successor to Amenhotep III, which means that the ship could not have set sail before the reign of Queen Nefertiti. Wood dendrochronology also has the rings of the tree around 1320 BCE. And another dating method available to archaeologists would be the Mycenaean and Minoan pottery on board the ship. Most of it was late Hadaldic 3A2, which is from the later part of the 14th century, the later part of the 1300s BCE. There's also raw glass, ivory, ebony, wood from Nubia, so we have Egyptian imperial economy present on the ship, food and weapons, and many other artifacts on board. I encourage you all to look it up and read through it. Other than diagnostic Egyptian craft works bearing the mark of Neferuaten, which was a name used by Queen Nefertiti, but only within the first 5 years of Akhenaten's reign, that was also on board, which allows for even more precise dating method. It also illustrates just how interconnected peoples were by looking at, this is a small temple of Aten in the site of Amarna. That's the capital city that Amenhotep III's son established during his reign. One of the letters found here, the famous Hand of Nergral. I also wanted to mention one of the Amarna letters, that's Amarna letter EA35. This was a cuneiform script in the Akkadian language, the diplomatic lingua franca of the day, between the Egyptian pharaoh, probably Akhenaten, and the ruler of Alatia, modern-day Cyprus. Within the letter, friendly statements are made wishing the Egyptian pharaoh and his family and household well, and also several requests are made by the Alahian king of modern-day Cyprus, including a request for oils, silver, and even requesting a person skilled in vulture augury. But the king of Alatia, modern-day Cyprus, sends 500 talents of copper to the Egyptian ruler, and we can't be sure, but this may have been around 1,500 kilograms or 3,300 pounds. The letter also contains a complaint by the king of Alatia, the king of modern-day Cyprus, that the hand of Nergral, evidently some sort of deity associated with death and pestilence, has caused the death of many of the ruler's subjects, and he bemoans that there is not a single copper craftsman left. This, despite sending the Egyptian king a large sum of copper, the king apologizes for the small amount he sends because 3,300 pounds of copper evidently was a small amount for a king in the late Bronze Age. The Hand of Nergral, very, very ominous name. Altogether, then, the Colossi of Amenhotep III are far more than just a giant couple of statues with a bunch of Greek and Minoan place names written on it in hieroglyphs. Rather, we see an Egyptian state engaging in international relations of the Bronze Age, establishing economic and military alliances with the Mycenaeans in order to counter the growing threat of the Hittites in Anatolia, while also engaging in trade, especially the import of oils and wine from Greece into Egypt. We also see a disconnect between the propaganda on the Colossi and the friendly communications between rulers in the Amarna letter, revealing elites of Egypt had a public and private use of powers that was exclusive to time and place. Indeed, the royal family of Egypt had, by the time of Amenhotep III, consolidated power and inserted itself into the important priesthoods and deities across Egypt. This is something reflected in the architecture, especially at Karnak, the holiest of places in the New Kingdom of Egypt, and also at the Colossi themselves, the recording and veneration of a diplomatic mission that sought military and economic alliance against the Hittites. This is something one would equate with perhaps the Roman Empire or another expansive power from history in terms of monumentality, and certainly Egypt was no exception to the pitfalls of imperialism, imperialistic thinking. But that's enough for now. Thank you for watching. Kyle, the Angry Archaeologist.